How you have fallen from heaven, Lucifer, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth. You who once laid low the nations, you said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of El. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zion. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will be like the Most High, but you are brought down to the realm of the dead.
O Lucifer, son of the dawn, how you have fallen. Right? Has he fallen? Who's Lucifer? I thought his name was Satan. Well, if you go back to ancient Israel and ask an Israelite who Satan is, they'll look at you with a puzzled face, because Satan is mentioned nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. However, there are 3 passages in the Old Testament that do mention a figure named Satan, although one may not be him. So, what we will do is go over all 3 of these mentions and see if we can find anyone close to Satan. The first mention of Satan that we have in the Hebrew Bible comes from the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, which reads us this. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh. Satan also came among them. And Yahweh said to Satan, From where do you come? So Satan answered Yahweh, and said, From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. And then Yahweh said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? Now, there are 2 interesting things to note here. The first thing to note is that these sons of God are coming to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan is also coming among these sons of God. The second interesting thing to note is that the name Satan in the Hebrew shown on the screen here, the definite article before it is ha. Ha means the. So that means in Hebrew, the name isn't Satan, but actually the Satan, which means this isn't a proper name, but instead is a title. This shows that Ha-Satan in the book of Job, rather than being some arch nemesis of God that we know him as today, was actually a member of God's heavenly court. So, if he was a member of God's heavenly court, then what was his role? Well, the name Ha-Satan in Hebrew means the accuser, so his role was likely to accuse or antagonize human beings and test their faith in Yahweh. Although there is this very interesting paper that argues the name Ha-Satan, rather than meaning the accuser, should actually mean the executioner. But for simplicity's sake, for the rest of the video, I will go along with a more general understanding of the name Ha-Satan and say the accuser. So, we know he's a member of God's heavenly court, but who is he? That does not seem to be important in the story. In the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, it states, the force of the definite article is to de-emphasize precise identity and focus on the status of the character as it is relevant to the narrative plot. This means that the identity of the divine being here is unimportant, and what matters is that someone that has the current status of accuser is being introduced into the narrative. This is actually consistent with known Israelite and Mesopotamian legal practice, as accuser was a legal status that various peoples temporarily acquired in appropriate circumstances. It is also interesting to note that Ha-Satan parallels the king's eye, or the king's ears, who are active in Persian courts. These agents operated as some sort of secret police, and they report their findings to the king of the Persian Empire. This parallels how Ha-Satan reports to Yahweh what he has observed on the earth. Hence, he says he roamed to and fro the earth. For a more comprehensive reading on the king's eyes, I'd recommend the article called The Eyes of the Lord, which goes more into depth about the king's eyes, their role, and even connections it has to Ha-Satan in the Bible. Here Ha-Satan is also depicted as subject to Yahweh, as divine council imagery depicts him among the sons of God, indicating he is not equal with Yahweh in any way, shape, or form. Some think that Ha-Satan is an intruder in this passage because it says that he is coming among the sons of God. But this is unlikely, because in passages like Genesis 23:10 and 2 Kings 4:13, coming from among seems to imply a membership of a group, indicating that Ha-Satan was with the sons of God here. Ha-Satan's role in this passage seems to be to act as an adversary for humans, because in this passage he is accusing Job of not actually being faithful to Yahweh, but only doing so because his life is going so good. Every time Hasatan acts against Job, he has to do so with Yahweh's permission, and if Yahweh tells Hasatan not to do something, Hasatan cannot overstep his bounds and must submit to Yahweh, indicating that he is not his own independent figure, but subservient to Yahweh. So, our first mention of Satan in the book of Job, and he's actually just one of the members of God's heavenly court, playing his role as the accuser. What's even more interesting is that he's never depicted in a negative light in the book of Job, but it's just carrying out God's actions of accusing humans and testing their faith in him. So, Satan's next mention is in the book of Zechariah, chapter 3, verse 1, and it reads as follows. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of Yahweh, and Satan standing at his right hand to oppose him. And then Yahweh said to Satan, Yahweh rebuke you, Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire? In this verse, the word translated as Satan is Hasatan, as in the book of Job. So the verse would better be read as this. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of Yahweh, and the accuser standing at his right hand to oppose him. Although the accuser in this verse is acting out his role as a prosecuting attorney, what is interesting is that the accuser is rebuked. This means that Yahweh's members on the divine council could be in opposition to him and weren't necessarily always good. As it says in the amazing commentary on HAGGAI and Zechariah 1-8 by Karel L. and Eric M. MEYERS, the emerging personification of the figures in the divine council, both positive and negative, is a major feature of exilic and post-exilic biblical writing, and the book of Zechariah bears unmistakable testimony to this process. One more interesting thing to note is that Hasatan is not necessarily in the wrong here. As we later find out, Joshua's garments were dirty and later have to be replaced with clean garments, meaning he was guilty, but the reason Hasatan is rebuked here is because Yahweh has decided to have mercy on Joshua despite his filthy garments. As stated in the commentary on HAGGAI and Zechariah, Hasatan is only depicted in a negative light here because he was made unaware of the change. Although he is rebuked here, he is not rebelling against Yahweh and is still seen as subordinate, as it is Yahweh's will that ultimately triumphs, and in this divine council setting, he is simply taking the role of a prosecuting attorney. So, in the book of Zechariah, we see Hasatan acting as a prosecuting attorney, and he is also rebuked by Yahweh. Although being rebuked here, he is not without reason for his accusations, as Joshua is guilty, hence why his garments are dirty. The only reason that Hasatan is depicted as negative in this passage is because he was not aware that Yahweh was going to have mercy on Joshua despite his filthy garments. And throughout all of this, Hasatan is still seen as subordinate to Yahweh, as it is Yahweh's will that ultimately triumphs, and Hasatan is just playing the role of prosecuting attorney in Yahweh's divine council. Now, the last mention of Satan comes in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, which reads as follows. Now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. Now, what makes this verse more interesting than the others is that the name Satan here is an actual name and not just a title. This is because the definite article ha is not preceding the name Satan in the Hebrew. Although Satan does not have a definite article preceding it in the Hebrew, it does not necessarily mean that this is a proper name. The reason for this is because we know something sketchy is going on in this passage, because it is paralleled in the Deuteronomistic history by 2 Samuel 24:1. Now 2 Samuel 24:1 reads as follows. Again the anger of Yahweh was aroused against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, Go, number Israel and Judah. Now, we know the chronicler uses the Deuteronomistic history as a source text, so it is clear that the chronicler is altering the text to remove Yahweh from enticing David. Now, some take this as some kind of early proto-Satan forming in the Hebrew religion, as it seems in this passage that the chronicler is using Satan here to take the malevolent behavior from Yahweh. However, this is problematic because the chronicler does not necessarily distance Yahweh from malevolent actions, such as in 2 Chronicles 10:15 and 2 Chronicles 18:18-22, where Yahweh sanctions lies and instigates behavior that causes harm. A more likely explanation is that the chronicler is trying to depict David in a more positive light. As compared to the Deuteronomistic history, the chronicler depicts David's reign in a more positive way. Sometimes the chronicler just straight up deletes accounts that depict David in a negative light. The chronicler, however, could not take out this story as the census, because it culminated in the erection of what the chronicler understood to be the altar of the Solomonic temple, and David's relationship with the temple was very important to the chronicler. So, it is likely that the chronicler in this passage took out the reference to Yahweh and replaced it with Satan so that David's relationship with Yahweh can be seen in a more favorable light. But however, this still does not answer why the chronicler used Satan in the first place. So for a good explanation on why, I will quote Paul Evans. And he says, although the chronicler did not see God as altogether separate from evil, he, being a product of his post-exilic age, saw a more developed role for divine intermediaries. As mentioned above, this could have been the result of the chronicler's exposure to the book of Job, where Hasatan was a part of the heavenly entourage and was used by Yahweh to test human beings. Thus, the chronicler believed that in his vorlage, when God enticed David to number the people, this was done through a mediator, Satan. In this way, the chronicler was not intending to contradict the vorlage, but to better explain it. This reinterpretation by the chronicler is consistent with subsequent development of angelology and later intertestamental literature. These later books, which retold Old Testament narratives, for example, Jubilees, tended to bring in angels where there were none in the original Old Testament text. Often, the writer would introduce intermediaries to perform an act which God himself performs in the original story. In a similar manner, the chronicler replaces the original narrative's account of God directly enticing David with a heavenly intermediary. This makes sense as elsewhere in 2 Chronicles 18:21, Yahweh gives permission to a lying spirit to do his will. This shows that in this passage as well, the chronicler can be understanding Satan to being an agent of Yahweh's will. So, today we went over 3 passages. The first one in Job, where Hasatan is the son of God acting out his role as accuser. The second one is Zechariah 3:1, in which Hasatan is acting as a prosecuting attorney against Joshua the high priest. And in the third passage, the chronicler is likely using Satan as a divine intermediary to take on Yahweh's actions as a reinterpretation of 2 Samuel 24:1. In none of these passages do we find anything close to a Satan as we know him as today. So, if this devil is not in the Old Testament, then where did he come from? Well, in my next video, I'll be going over all the passages that seem to suggest some kind of backstory for a malevolent figure named Satan in the Old Testament. But until then, remember, question everything, learn something, but answer nothing.